This is the Coast Business Radio Podcast.
John Blackburn is a consultant in the field of defence and national security. In 2007, he was appointed an officer in the Military Division of the Order of Australia. He holds a Master of Arts and a Master of Defence Studies. John has extensive experience across the fields of strategy, policy, planning, operational command, capability development and material acquisition. He is chairman of the Institute of Integrated Economics Research Australia, the Institute for Regional Security and Australian Strategic Policy Institute Council member. John retired from the Royal Australian Air Force in 2008 as the Deputy Chief of the Air Force, following a career as a fighter pilot, test pilot and strategic planner. John's senior posts include Commander of the Integrated Area Defence System, located in Malaysia, commanding a multinational headquarters established to effect the 5 power defence arrangements, and head of strategic policy in the Defence Headquarters. John, first of all, welcome.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you for the invitation to talk to you.
The Institute for Integrated Economic Research Australia released a report this year looking at Australia's medical supply chain. Now, the report notes that Australia imports over 90% of medicines and is at the end of a very long global supply chain, making the nation vulnerable to supply chain disruptions. What type of medicines did your report look at, John?
Well, it's basically all of them. We make about 10% of our medicines in Australia, and these are ones that are on patent. But what's happened is because of pricing, generics, for example, are mostly imported. And when you actually trace back through, as best we can, where our medicines come from, it's a very complicated and opaque supply chain. So basically, look at vast majority of medicines. We're not sure what the supply chain looks like. We don't know what the risks are. And Australia, unlike a lot of other countries, doesn't require the industry to hold minimum stock levels. So when something goes wrong, it goes wrong badly.
Given that we import most of our pharmaceuticals from the US and they import the ingredients or the inputs mostly from China, is the US as vulnerable as we are?
Absolutely. And the reason we looked at this, because the medicine supply chain is only one of a range of aspects that we've looked at in our institute. In the middle of last year, a United States Commission inquiry into the United States' dependence on China for medicines and medical supplies highlighted a whole bunch of risks which they said was a risk to their national security. So we contacted one of the authors of a book called China RX, who had presented to that commission and had a long conversation. And then we said, hang on, if you're having that problem, surely we are. So we started digging into it. And yes, we have the problem. 21 or 2% of our medicines come via the US, 57% comes by the European Union, and they've all got the same problem. So we've got a serious problem we have to address.
China is also the largest manufacturer of vaccines in the world, supplying about 20% of the global supply. So even if scientists can develop a vaccine for COVID-19, how high are the risks that we would be relying on China to either make it or supply, say, the ingredients to manufacturers?
Oh, significantly. The exact percentage we can't tell you because there's no analysis of it. Strangely, that report our institute put out appears to be the only public report in Australia about these supply chain risks. So the current situation is it's a serious problem. To do something about it requires a policy and a strategy, not only for medicines, but a whole range of things that says, how do we make Australia more resilient? But right now in a crisis, we're dealing with that reality.
Your report made some recommendations. What were they and what has been the reaction from Canberra?
What we're basically saying is you can't address any problem if you don't do a risk analysis, whether it's fuel, which I've done a lot of work in, or medicines, or a whole range of areas. So number one, we've got to do a proper risk assessment and analysis of our medicine supply chains and for medical equipment, because remember we ran out of masks during the bushfires? Mm-hmm. Well, exactly the same problem there. So number one, do a risk assessment. And then number two, when you look at it, you've got to make some decisions. What level of capability should we have that's guaranteed? So what do we want to be manufactured or produced or managed in Australia? And then for the rest of it, because the medicines are pretty important, how do we actually address the supply chains to make sure they're trusted? In other words, they're transparent, verifiable. And a part of that is you've got to say we need to keep a certain amount of medicines in stock. So we don't require any in Australia, but for example, the Finnish government requires that for 1,457 critical medicines, they must maintain between 3 and 10 months of stock in the country, depending on what they are.
That's amazing and fairly scary if you think about it. What can be done right away? What's stopping us then stockpiling the most needed drugs?
Where are you going to get them from? That's what's stopping us. So essentially, we've seen things like India restrict exports of its medicines, and they're a very large medicine supplier, because the active pharmaceutical ingredients they depend upon also come from China. So they closed down some of their exports, and you've seen this happen across the world. In the middle of a crisis, all you can do is manage as best you can, which is what we're doing. But we failed to prepare for the crisis, so we have significant risks. Now, once we get through this crisis, we've got to make sure we're better prepared for the next one.
Well, when this virus hit, why didn't they then direct, say, maybe all the funding to isolation and health, such as hospitals, ICU? Why do you think they closed down the economy?
The only thing you can do in a crisis is take the best reaction possible. And the issue here was, with some of the projections and the analysis that had been done prior to this, the best thing you can do is stop the infection rate growing rapidly, because it's not just a medicine issue. What we didn't publish in our report, because we didn't think it was probably productive to do this, is that when you start looking at Australia's hospital capacity, we have some serious challenges. We have 25% less hospital beds per 1,000 people than the OECD average. And in Australia, prior to the pandemic, this was about 3.7 beds per 1,000 people if you add up the private and public hospital system. Japan, for example, has 12, and I think Korea had 8. So many, many more tons of hospital beds. Prior to the pandemic, we only had 2,200 ventilators, and there's been a lot of work trying to build that. The problem being is that to use a ventilator, there are 3 critical drugs you need. They're in short supply. So even if you've got the ventilators, if you haven't got the drugs, you've got a problem. So the only thing you can do in a crisis is try and stop the virus growing to its potential, because it would have overwhelmed the hospital system, and that would have been bad. So what I think the government, federal and state governments, did was really smart and showed a really good way to work as a team in a crisis.
Now, you've been pretty critical of our stockpile of crude oil. Aussie government spending $94 million, if not already, to begin building up a stockpile of crude oil, but will initially store the fuel in the US. Now, I sort of think maybe not so secure, because the only way to get it to Australia is by sea. Are we still as vulnerable?
Oh, absolutely. That makes no difference whatsoever to our domestic energy security. And I said this to the Energy Minister recently. So it's back to the same principle. When you look at a supply chain, you've got to do a risk analysis. And that's what I've been arguing since 2011. And thankfully, Andrew Hastie, as the chair of the Joint Standing Committee on Intelligence Security, did raise with that committee a task on government to do a liquid fuel security review. Let's understand what our risk is. That review was supposed to be done by the end of 2018. It still hasn't been done, and the report's sitting on the Energy Minister's desk. Now, once you look at what your risks are, you then come up with a plan and a strategy, what you're going to do about it. Well, we don't have that. So going off and just buying some oil in America might be a way to buy some cheap oil, but it's not part of a strategy or plan that we know about. And therefore, what's the point? Let's do the risk analysis and work out how to make things more secure here. Putting oil in the American caverns is not going to make it more secure here.
Government ministers and bureaucrats then are paid a lot of money to sort these things out. Why aren't they attending to these matters? And why are they wasting so much time? And is it sort of on the back burner? It's not that important, and every now and then it might just sort of spike up.
Well, I found this problem on both sides of politics. When I first started this, the Labor government was there, and I spoke with the Labor Energy Minister, who I think half comically but half seriously suggested I should just go away and focus on defence problems like a good little boy. But, I've dealt with bullies before, so I just ignored him. And that motivated me to do something about this. So both sides of politics haven't addressed it. Why? Well, there's pretty strong focus from the industry lobbies, where the money is. Oh, look, there's not a problem. We can manage everything. Don't give us any regulation and control. Just go away. And so successive governments have gone along with that pressure from industry to, oh, look, don't worry, there's nothing to see here. It even got to the stage where the Department of Energy said, I think last year, Oh, we haven't had a problem for 30 years, so there's nothing to worry about. It requires, unfortunately, a crisis or a trigger before we all go, oh, perhaps we should do something. The COVID-19 crisis is a trigger for us to say, hell, we've just been surprised. But if you've done any research on these things in the past, you wouldn't have been. This now gives us an opportunity to have a different conversation with the Australian public.
Now, you hate fake media, obviously. You're involved in the Very Media project at verymedia.org, which says democracies only function if voters can make well-informed decisions. Once we lose the ability to know and understand, they are ultimately doomed, and votes are bought by the people with the largest budgets who can afford to define their version of the truth. Tell us about the project and its aims.
Well, the aims of this project were being run by our sister organisation in Europe, the AAR there. And their intent was, seeing all this fake media problem, is how can we set up, not just single, but be a part of a network of media verification areas where that can be analysed, look at the various range of research, a bit like ABC fact-checked in some ways, but this was an independent group that they were looking at, to try and say, look, we've looked into this doesn't look quite right, there's a problem here. The reason being is this. Democracies do not function without open discussion and media. And that, to me, is one of the most fundamental things. If that media ownership becomes concentrated only in the hands of a few very rich people, then there is a potential for that being distorted. And also, as we're seeing in America, there's a lot of almost political argument about fake medias, etc., which really undermines people's confidence in it. If you've got a way of verifying it, then you can have a trusted media. And that is essential for us. We have to have robust discussion in the media that's trusted. And that can't come about by just single organisations or a small number. And that was the intent of Verimedia.
President Trump signed an executive order to fight online censorship by technology corporations, including social media platforms. Let me play you a grab from the signing of the order to fight online censorship.
A small handful of powerful social media monopolies controls a vast portion of all public and private communications in the United States. And we know what they are. We don't have to name them. We're going to give you a complete listing. We're going to give you a signed copy of what I'm going to be signing in a couple of minutes, and you'll see exactly what we're doing. They've had unchecked power to censor, restrict, edit, shape, hide, alter virtually any form of communication between private citizens or large public audiences. There's no precedent in American history for so small a number of corporations to control so large a sphere of human interaction.
The White House says, and I quote, tech bias is a major issue facing our democracy. It challenges the free exchange of ideas and public debate that protects our civil liberties. Every citizen, liberal, conservative or otherwise, has a right to be heard and treated fairly online. What's your thoughts on that?
I think as a principle that a fair, an open media and open communications is important. I think there need to be some issues there when you get some of the racial dimensions playing into, and I think in Australia we've got some legislation. In the US, whilst there are many good aspects there, as having lived there for a number of years as you have, what I see right now is almost a political civil war occurring. And the problem there being is that where there are problems, there are also those on the political side. And in the case of President Trump, his behaviour, clear distortion of facts over times, I just don't have any faith in anything that he would be saying at the present time. The principle underlying that we have to have an active media that doesn't censor things in areas, and therefore a diverse media, I agree with, but I just could never go along with what President Trump's saying.
Most people have a sense of what fake news may be, but do we know anything about interest-driven media that promotes false facts for its own ends? And who are these organisations and people, and how can they be outed?
That was the intent with Verimedia, and the challenge that has run into there is trying to get the funding to make it run, because a lot of these, like our institute, we're self-funded. And in Europe, they had some funding, but limited. They're still trying to do it if they can get it. But you can imagine a range of different groups trying to do the Verimedia thing provides public with an option to look at different sources, in this case that are not controlled by a large business or financial interest, to give them the opportunity to make their own decision. Now, you have to have it open from all sides of politics and perspectives. And that's what Very Media was trying to do. Challenge Course Comes is trying to get the funding to do it. As we're seeing in Australia today, with large number of media institutions or areas being closed down because of funding reasons, that's a serious loss, I think, of discussion capability in a democratic country.
Your experience in defence and national security, just offshore we have the dragon getting angrier with China, with India, with Taiwan, and also with the South China Sea. Where do you see all this, and also, sorry, can't forget Hong Kong, where do you see all this heading? Are they being a little bit too sensitive, or are they actually starting to muscle in?
I think it's the latter. I mean, they've been identified around the world that the power competition, particularly US and China, is going to be a significant risk for us in the future. And certainly from a military perspective, you look at what's happening in the South China Sea, the prospect there of future conflict or even interruption of critical things like supply chains is a concern. The more immediate concern I've been worried about here for us in Australia, and it's the one that was identified very well in a whole series of ASPI reports, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, is the degree of foreign ownership of critical infrastructure in Australia. And examples there were the Darwin port that went out on this 99-year lease to a Chinese-owned company. In my view, that was absolutely daft. And we've seen the Foreign Investment Review Board have a greater degree of control and oversight since. But the ASPI reports did highlight the degree of electricity and gas network ownership from foreign companies. This is a problem, particularly if some aspects of control of those networks are taken offshore. We're now seeing aspects of our ports where port access and some functions are being offshored to the Philippines. We've got to get a bit of a common sense look at this. There are certain functions, systems, critical infrastructure where we must have control of that infrastructure in Australia. That doesn't mean we don't have foreign investment, but I think we've had too open approach to this, and we need to have a really serious look at that.
What about the Belt and Road Initiative with Victoria? Before we get to your comment on that, up until the last few days, I was thinking, yes, Victoria has acted quite naughty here. They'll be in the naughty corner for what they're doing, but it goes right back to 2017 with Australia that we were also engaging with China and the Belt and Road Initiative.
Having read part of what the Australian newspaper report was this morning, saying that, look, Victoria, in discussions with the Department of Foreign Affairs, took and interpreted or had the discussion that this wasn't going to be a problem. Now, if that is correct from the reports, I think what we're seeing here is an interesting problem. As a federation and our structure of state and federal responsibilities has shown some challenges in the past, and thankfully everyone's working as an integrated team right now to deal with COVID. That's really important. But you can get different perspectives, whether it's a defence view or a foreign affairs view or a domestic security view. And then you have to step back and say, okay, well, how do we guide this? What's our strategy of dealing with it? You know, we do not have a national security strategy in this country.
Really?
We had one back in 2013 for a little while. I was involved with some of the working groups to build it, but it was blown away by the Tony Abbott government. So what we really need is something that brings together not just a defence view or a foreign affairs or a domestic security. We need to have an integrated national security strategy. And Jim Molan's been talking about that a lot in the media in the last few months. So whether it's a national security strategy or national resilience strategy, you can't take separate views from separate departments or states if they are going to have a potential impact on our national security and resilience. We've got to have a way of dealing with it. Now, with our constitution, that needs a cooperative approach. But if we don't have that strategy in place and a vehicle to work around it, then we're all going to go off and work in stovepipes. And I think we're seeing the symptoms of that with this Belt and Road Initiative in Victoria.
And the other thing is with our defence, I mean, I see that, and there's two parts of this. I mean, we see that the submarines, will have those in about 35 years' time, and we've got frigates and stuff. So at the moment, we've got our submarines, the Oberon class, I think they're called, and it's really nice because we can at least notify the enemy that we're approaching because they can hear us. And then we have these new submarines, which are great because why use a perfectly good nuclear reactor or engine? We might as well just put some diesel in there from the Massey Ferguson, or someone said from the Victor lawnmower. Do you think that submarines are going to be enough? Do you think they're good enough? And do you think that we should probably act a bit faster, unless we have to write to the Chinese and Indonesians and others, look, don't attack us for another 35 years. We're not exactly ready just yet, so can you hang out just for a while?
Well, here's the reality of the world. With the size of our country in terms of population and economy, the only way we can achieve effective defence is with a team. And that's why the Five Eyes Alliance has been so important. And that's why the relationship with the United States in a defence sense is absolutely critical. So the issue then, when you look across this, you need a defence capability, but if we look nationally at our resilience and our nation's defence beyond a military capability, that's where we've got a much more urgent problem. Now, people talk about let's double defence expenditure and it will act as a deterrent. Well, remember the relative sizes here of our countries and the threat. We will only ever be a deterrence as a part of an alliance force. And that means we've got to work with our regional neighbours a lot more closely. Where do I see the risk coming? If we allow this back to the critical infrastructure bit, people to own this stuff. It's like we're in a house and we're going to put bars on the front of the house and we're going to deter someone from coming out by getting a bigger gun. That's going to scare them away. If you've allowed the enemy or the adversary to actually control the power supply coming to your house and the water supply and the gas supply, and you've let them go around the back door and get in through the back door and inside your computer systems in the cyber sense, then I don't care how big the gun is you're going to buy next year. It's not going to deter anybody if they're already inside your house. And that's the fundamental problem. We tend to look at it in a stovepipe, buy more defence capability because of this, instead of looking at the totality of it. Our more closer threat, near-time threat, is not a military conflict up in the South China Sea. It's losing control of our sovereignty where it matters. And that's where I think we should be focusing during the recovery, the economic recovery behind this virus. Where do we invest money? Where do we put the stimulus funds that improve our security, our resilience as a whole as a nation, not just focus at the project level, where there are issues, but we've got a bigger set of problems we've got to address sooner.
It's interesting days ahead. Would not like to be in Hong Kong right now, probably around Taiwan. Where else can I pick on it? What about India? I mean, China, they're like parts of India and the South China Sea. It's all a bit nervy at the moment.
There is a lot of concern about it, but here comes the thing. Whilst we can react well, which is what we're doing, the most important thing is to take some principles out of defence. It's called preparedness. So let's try and learn something from this and all the previous inquiries we've had. How do we prepare better for the next crisis? It's not the same as this one. And in defence, it's called readiness and sustainability. So as a society, let's learn from this and prepare better, which is what we have failed to do repeatedly. The next thing is, in addition to preparing, is you've got to adapt. The world's changing. The reality is it is going to continue changing. So we need to adapt to it and accept the reality of that change and work out how we work better in that new world. And of course, the third layer is how do we prevent things going wrong if we can. But you can't have a society that's great at reacting if it doesn't prepare, adapt and prevent. And we haven't been very good at that because we've been too complacent. That's what I reckon we've got to focus on.